good evening, Cyclones everywhere, and welcome to the Iowa Stater Virtual Book Club event. Tonight's event will feature the book Moments of Impact, Injury, Racialized Memory, and Reconciliation in College Football by Jaime Schultz. My name is Matt Van Winkle with the ISU Alumni Association. Joining me is Kirsten Cracklio, also with the Alumni Association. Kirsten, this is your very first event. Welcome.
Thank you. Excited to be here with everyone.
Absolutely. Well, we're in a snowy, cold Ames, Iowa, central Iowa right now. We know lots of people are watching with us. Go ahead and put in the comments where you're watching from. But yeah, we're really excited to have everyone here joining us today. Yeah. So Kirsten, yeah, like we said, put in where you're watching from in the chat, city and state. I know you recently joined us from Arizona, where it's much warmer than it is here now. I don't know if we have anyone from Arizona watching, but hopefully there's a few people watching from where it's a little bit warmer today.
And if you are, I'm very jealous. I think we all are a little jealous of that.
Yes, absolutely. Well, at the end of the night, tonight, we're going to be picking one person at random who puts a comment or question in the chat who's going to receive an ISU prize pack. But before we get started, we would like to say a quick thank you to Dog-Eared Books here in Ames, who is the official sponsor of our Iowa Stater Book Club. Dog-Eared is owned by two Ames natives, Ellen Grimm, who's an Iowa State grad, and also Amanda Lepper. Dog-Eared Books is located on Main Street in Ames. You can purchase books from their website to be shipped to you. You can also check them out on social media, on Facebook, Instagram, TikTok. Just search Dog-Eared Books Ames. And we also want to take a moment to thank members of the ISU Alumni Association, some of whom are tuning in today. We thank you for joining us. And because of your membership, we're able to offer student and alumni programming like the Iowa Stater Book Club. So thank you so much for your commitment to Cyclones everywhere. We also invite you, if you're not a member of the Alumni Association and you value programming like the book club here today, please do consider joining us today at isualum.org/join to get started. Again, isualum.org/join, as you can see on your screen. Well, now I'd like to introduce the author of our book tonight, Jaime Schultz. We're going to bring her into the stage. Hey, Jaime.
Hi.
Well, Jaime is a professor of kinesiology at Penn State University. She's an award-winning teacher, scholar. She's published 6 books and nearly 70 articles and chapters. She currently serves as co-editor for the University of Illinois Press Sport and Society series. So, Jaime, thank you so much for joining us here on the Iowa Stater Book Club.
Oh, thank you so much, Matt, and thank you, Kirsten, and thanks everybody. I can't see you. I wish I could see who was here, but yeah, I'm. Is it okay if I say something?
Absolutely, yeah. Like you said, we do have people watching from everywhere. We have Florida and California. So yes, as we mentioned, Kirsten, warmer destination, San Antonio, Texas. So we're all over. We call it Cyclones everywhere here at Iowa State.
Yeah, that's terrific. I just wanted to say how grateful I am. I was thinking about this, and academic books, we write them, we put our heart and soul into them and lots of time, but we also usually think that nobody's ever going to read our books. I mean, that's just sort of the reality of academic books. And so I'm just so grateful that anybody would read it, much less the Alumni Association at the wonderful Iowa State. And so I'm so grateful, and I'm so thankful to Matt and Kirsten for bringing me here and helping me do this. So thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you.
All right. So how tonight will work, Matt and I have prepared some questions for you to get the discussion going. But we'd also encourage everyone to add comments and questions in the chat, which we can add in at the end of our discussion. Awesome. All right. So we'll kick it off. So we'd love to know what path brought you to teaching about inequity in sports, and why was it important for you to tell these 3 stories specifically?
Oh my goodness. Okay, so I am originally from Iowa. I went to Luther College. I played soccer in college, and after I graduated, I wanted to keep coaching. I really loved it. So I was coaching at a high school. I was coaching at a college. I wanted to keep doing it, so I enrolled in a program at the University of Iowa in psychology of sport, and I thought that would help me be a better coach. And while I was there, that was part of a bigger sports studies program. And there was a separate program called cultural studies of sport. It's sort of like sociology and history of sport. I didn't know that you could study sport. I studied English and Spanish as an undergraduate. I had no idea that those kinds of things existed. And I never really thought critically about sport before I entered that program, even though it had been such a huge part of my life. So I took a couple classes in that program, fell in love with it. Ended up I stopped coaching when I started to pursue my PhD. But while I was getting my PhD, I had the chance to teach a class, and it was actually called Inequality in Sport. And it was a class of undergraduates. It was maybe 50 people in the class. And I had one student, I had a lot of wonderful, excellent students, but one student stood out. And I think it's okay for me to tell the story because I've asked him before if it's all right. But it was a student named Jaime Smith who happened to be a really good wrestler at Iowa and a really good student. And we were talking about race, and it happened to be that Iowa and Minnesota, the football game was coming up that weekend. And every year, Iowa and Minnesota play for the Floyd of Rosedale Trophy. And if you don't know what it is, it's the statue of a bronze hog. It sounds like a silly trophy anyway.
It's a very Minnesota and Iowa thing.
so Iowa, Minnesota. But Jasmine, we were talking about race, and he said, "Did you know that this statue, this trophy, is actually connected to a Black player at Iowa that was injured while he was playing?" And I grew up in Iowa City. My dad played football for Iowa for a bit. I'd never heard that story. It was news to me, and I was really intrigued. And I'm sorry this is a long-winded answer, but I have to give Jasmine credit. I was just really intrigued by the story, and so I started to do a little bit of digging, and of course he was right about it. And the more digging I did, the more stories started to come up that were somewhat similar, including Jack Trice at Iowa State and Johnny Bright at Drake University. So those three men are sort of central to the book. And nobody had really connected their stories before. They might have referenced them, but there was a really, I thought, a strong connection, particularly because their injuries had been remembered or forgotten through some form of material culture. They all played in Iowa in the first half of the 20th century. So, I stumbled into the graduate program. I got lucky enough to meet Jasmine, and that's how it started.
All came together. Thank you for sharing that.
It's really interesting. And as we got to talk with you a little bit before this, you were telling us that Moments of Impact was actually part of your PhD project.
Mm-hmm.
What, as you were doing the research for that project, really stood out to you the most as you were really putting together this book for people?
So I have a couple answers. And first, and I'm not just saying this because I'm talking to an Iowa State Alumni Association,
Mm-hmm.
the archivists at your library are incredible. They were
Yes.
so generous to me. They kept beautiful records of what happened. They spent time. I've asked them over the years to help me with different things, and they have. So I should say that stuck out to me because,
Yeah.
archivists in general are pretty generous people, but the
Mm-hmm.
Iowa State archivists are just fantastic.
Yes.
Definitely some unsung heroes. I know we definitely rely on them a lot for the magazine as well for some of that
Yeah.
Isn't that true? Yeah.
And I'm
content.
glad you
Mhm.
brought that up too, Jamie, because I don't know if you were back the week of the Jack Trice, the 100 celebration, but the registrar's office was actually able to pull Jack Trice's official record as a student. So they had all those documents dating back to 100 years, and they were able to officially make him an alum of Iowa State and mark that officially on his record, which they hadn't done before. So really speaks to what you were saying, just how great of a records they keep. So
Yeah.
apologize for stepping in there, but I wanted to add that.
It's a great story, and it just
Yeah.
reminds us, that you can't really tell a history without having those traces of the past, and if
Yeah.
nobody keeps those traces and keeps them organized and knows what's there, we can't have that history. So they really should get all the credit for this kind of stuff. And a lot of schools haven't kept the same kind of records that Iowa State has, and those stories are just lost. So your question was what stuck out to me, right? And
Yeah.
so, that's part of it. The other part, and I don't know if it occurred to me when I was putting the book together or at least working on my dissertation project, but over time, what sort of has occurred to me is that these men were activists. We've had a really important and significant wave of athlete activists in the last few years. Colin Kaepernick obviously comes to mind. And you can trace it back to, Kurt Flood in 1970 or Tommy Smith and John Carlos at the 1968 Olympics and their Olympic protest, or Muhammad Ali refusing conscription in 1967. So there is a history there. There's a legacy of this athlete activism. But I think a lot of people don't understand how far back it goes, because I don't think we often think of what they did as activism. They weren't speaking out against injustice, primarily because it wasn't safe to do that, right? There were very few, if we're looking specifically at football, very few Black players. Their positions on the team were tenuous. They were subjected to violence. There was all sorts of dangers against speaking out. So I think just by taking the field, it was an extremely courageous act. And I think we have to think of it in terms of athlete activism. It's like this first wave of athlete activism.
Yeah, that's really interesting.
Absolutely. Well, and that transitions us into our next question as well. So in your afterword, you write that sports films and other commemorative efforts may actually create historical and contemporary blind spots. And in light of, some of the recent events that have happened since this was published in 2016. So Colin Kaepernick's NFL protests that began that same year, and the racial protests during the unrest of 2020 and beyond. I'm just curious if you think that kind of still holds true, that some of these commemorative events and films can still create blind spots, where people feel like these are stories of the past that don't necessarily impact our now.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's such an interesting question, because I think some of that later activism with Kaepernick, or the WNBA players don't get enough credit for what they did, or the NBA players, or any number of people. Regardless of how people feel about some of what they've done to call attention to racial injustice, we have to acknowledge the fact that there is still that injustice that's going on. And I think sometimes, not always, but sometimes what commemorations or historical sport films like Remember the Titans or Glory Road or The Express, sometimes they tell these progressive narratives, right? That look how bad stuff was back then and look how much better it is now. And of course, there's been progress when it comes to racial issues and racial injustice. But sometimes those commemorations or those commemorative films make it seem as if racism was something that happened in the past, rather than sort of engaging with what's still going on in the present. And I mean, if we're looking at films, we want to feel good when we go to a film, right? And filmmakers want to make us feel good. We want to make us feel good about where we are in the world, and that's okay. But we have to be careful that it doesn't come at the expense of refusing to engage with some of the ongoing problems. Does that sort of address what you were asking?
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah. I think one of the most fascinating points too, and things that we've seen, especially in regards to the Jack Trice story, is the letter, right? The letter that he left behind in his coat pocket the day before the game that he wrote at the Curtis Hotel. And I think it's those tangible things that really can connect to people, and those words that he wrote down, right?
Mm-hmm.
That are still ringing true to this day.
Mm-hmm.
As we mentioned, Iowa State University celebrated 100 years of Jack Trice's death. As you looked at this story, and as you've had time to think about it, how do you think in the next 50 to 100 years people will continue to remember Jack's story? And I know there's a documentary being made about Jack Trice right now.
Mm-hmm.
People are still continuing to lift up his name through commemorations like Iowa State University's done. But how do you think people will continue to remember his story and tell his story?
That's tough. You started out the question by talking about the letter, right?
Sure. Yeah.
Without that letter, I mean, are we where we are today without that letter? I mean, it would be such a tragic loss regardless of the letter or not, but it's just the stuff that legends are made of, it's just the letter is just perfect, right? And then that harkens back to something we were talking about earlier, that somebody had the wherewithal to preserve that letter, that it's just, that's his writing. That's amazing. So 50 to 100 years from now, how will Trice be remembered? I think I'm optimistic. I think Iowa State has done so much to enshrine his memory, right? To make sure that his name, that his legacy is a part of Iowa State's identity. I think Iowa State deserves tremendous credit. It's the only, Power 5 football program that plays in a stadium that's named for a Black student athlete. That says something, right? We've got the legacy, we've got the artwork. There's the new, is it the Breaking Barriers statue? I got to be on campus last fall, and I was just so moved by that statue. There's been the renaming of the state to Jack Trice Way. There's been, there's so many ways that his name has been sort of fixed in Iowa State's collective memory. I can't see it fading anytime soon. I hope I'm right about that. Yeah, I think the legacy just will continue to grow. So.
Yeah.
And I mean, I'd love to hear what other people think about it. You're all Iowa State folks, and I'm just the outsider, but it's commendable the way that he's been remembered.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. One message that came through to me while I was reading this was the hard balance it can be for communities and institutions to recognize events like what happened to Trice, Simmons, and Bright. And so I'm curious what advice you would give to institutions who are seeking to commemorate a historical wrong. What elements make an event one with substance rather than maybe one of a performative nature?
So it's advice that I would give when you're trying to remember something that isn't great, right? What happened to him isn't great. I think, oh gosh. Your question was about whether it's substantive and not performative.
Because you talk to this in the book where it's this hard balance, right? You don't want to lose the story. You don't want to lose what happened. But that sometimes when it's just a commemoration, it could maybe, and I'm not speaking specifically to Trice necessarily, right. But, this is a broader topic of like, how do you write something from the past in a way that, has substance and is doing the event to the best way you can. I mean, you can't fix what happened, right? But honor it, I guess.
Yeah. I mean, and you want to make sure that you're not sort of like patting yourself on the back and saying, look at us, with this great commemoration, with, again, sort of ignoring some of the ongoing problems. I think it has to come with education. So oftentimes we'll name like a place or a building after someone, and that name is there. So at Penn State, our cultural center is named after Paul Robeson, who was a great football player at Rutgers, professional player, went on to got a law degree, was a stage actor. I've asked my students, and most of them don't know who Paul Robeson is. They know that his name is attached to the cultural center. So sometimes when we make those commemorative gestures, it sometimes licenses forgetting, right? We can put that up there and say we've done our part, but how do we teach people what's still, what the story is and why it's meaningful to our history, to our identity? I don't know if this answers your question. I was thinking, I'll go down a rabbit hole. So
it brings me to a point that I'd like to make that I know I've heard you speak about, Jaime, is some of almost the grassroots nature, right, of how these stories come to light, right? Mm-hmm. I believe it was, students that discovered, the Trice plaque in State Gym, mm-hmm. that kind of brought that story back to life. And I know you've mentioned, I believe it's Tom Emerson, who helped you a lot with this research and wrote an article many years ago. I don't know how long ago, but that really brought this back to the surface. Mm-hmm. So isn't it kind of like grassroots efforts like that can really help carry the story and give it life?
Oh, yeah. I think it's so much more powerful when it comes from the bottom up rather than the top down. Tom Emerson wrote that article in 1957. And he'll say, nothing happened after he wrote it. Nobody paid attention. And he was a student at the time. He went on to become a professor at Iowa State. And he's a wonderful man, if anybody knows him, just the best. But it wasn't until the early 1970s that story got retold again. And students were the ones who recognized, as Iowa State was in the process of building their new stadium that they hadn't named yet, that this would be a golden opportunity to remember this story, to remember the legacy of Jack Trice. And it was students who really just carried that torch in spite of, and we have to recognize, in spite of administrative and institutional opposition, who wanted to name the stadium for the largest donor. They carried that on through the 80s, and then they brought it back again in the mid 90s. And it was really student driven. It was really, really commendable.
I just have one other follow-up question to that, Jaime, and I'm curious your opinion on this. Jack Trice Stadium is the only Division I college football stadium named after an African American. Mm-hmm. Why do you think that is? Why do you think there's not more named after Black people? What do you think the reason behind that is? And do you think there's is it just like you've talked about in some of these stories, the the difficult subject matter with it? I mean, what do you think it is? I mean, what do you think personally? Do you think it is that Jack Trice Stadium is the only stadium named after an African American?
I I don't know. I
Yeah.
hope we'll see more. Now it's sort of commonplace to name
Yeah.
stadiums after, corporate sponsors, right?
Right.
So I don't know. I mean, I'd love to see a wave of this, a wave of change in that
Yeah.
regard, but I'm skeptical.
Hmm.
Um, part of me, another skeptical part is, he died, right?
Hmm.
Like, it's a way to sort of honor that legacy. Had he not, um, I don't know if it would have happened. There was a move I think it was in the 1970s, when the University of Iowa was rededicating their stadium, which is now Kinnick Stadium, named after Niall Kinnick, who died in World War II, was the only Heisman Trophy winner. But there was a move to also name it for Duke Slater, who was a tremendous black player at Iowa, and they came up against really strong resistance from local and state politicians. And ultimately, I mentioned this in the book, but I just think it's such a bitter irony. Ultimately, what they did was they named the stadium for Kinnick, which, that's great.
Hmm.
But they named a dormitory after Duke Slater. And the irony is that, for the first half of the 20th century across the United States, Black students were not allowed to live on campus.
Hmm.
So to name a dormitory after him when he couldn't have lived there, when he had been a player in the early 1900s, was really just sort of strange and bitterly ironic.
Hmm.
But your question was about stadiums, and I don't know how to answer
Yeah.
it, really.
Yeah. Right.
Yeah.
Kirsten, I know you had another question for Jaime, kind of just about the violence and the danger of football. Why don't you go ahead and ask that one?
Yeah, so something, and I guess maybe this is not a safe place to admit, but I am not a huge football fan, so I'm really sorry to
I
everyone.
am. That's okay. I'll
I'm
take
just,
it.
sports is not my thing. My first job was actually on a sports desk at a newspaper, and when they asked to hire me, I was like, "Do I have to like sports?" They said, "No." I said, "Great, I can copy edit."
There you go.
Sorry, little tangent there, but so something that stuck with me that maybe for others is already common knowledge was just how violent football was in the early days and like during the 20th century when these events happened, and how that kind of allowed for some of the violence that happened on the field with these players to kind of be swept under the rug a
Yeah.
little bit, and it's that debate of, was it because they were the best player? Was it, because they were black? Was it just because football was violent, and how these things came to be? And so thinking to present day, I'm seeing tons of headlines about CTE and how it's impacting young and older players. And so I just kind of wonder, when we look to the future, and we're looking back on present day football, I wonder, do you have any predictions for kind of how we'll view how athletes are treated today too, with kind of that same maybe surprise as when we look to the past?
I am really, really bad at predicting the future. It's like the question about what's going to happen in 100 years
Yeah.
about the way we remember Trice. But you're right. It's always been a violent game, right? And it's been violent in different ways. And I think, yeah, I think it's not going to stay the same as it is. I don't think it can, but I think that's what makes it so interesting when we look at the past, is that we can see that football used to be a much different game than it is today, which means that it can be different in the future, which is one of the really important things that we can learn from history, is that change is inevitable. But that idea that it was such a violent sport, you're right, absolutely complicates these narratives. It's easy to say, well, he wasn't hurt because he was black. It wasn't because of racism. He was a great player, and that's one of the strategies. We want to get out the best player, right? And it's a brutal game. In 1905, football was on the verge of extinction, right? And President Roosevelt calls the coaches of Harvard, Princeton, and Yale together, and they have a meeting. Next year, they issue a series of rule changes, and there's a committee that does that. And that committee, 4 years later, becomes the NCAA. But in the early 1900s, in some places they played a style of football that was more like soccer. In other places they played it was more like rugby. And so some of those rule changes actually made football what it is today. The institution of the forward pass was a big one, right? Spreading the field, the yards down system. Instead of having a scrum, we have the line of scrimmage, right? And that all comes about in those rule changes of 1906, 1905. So I think, we've had a couple of rule changes, things with the kickoff. I think people are working on technology for helmets. I don't know what you could do to football to make it that that
Yeah.
people aren't going to get concussed,
Yeah.
right? Or a
Yeah.
series of subconcussive hits that we're finding out actually does more damage than concussions. So there's helmet technology. Some people say that we play a game that's more like 7-on-7. That would make it. Some people say maybe we get rid of the helmet altogether and play more rugby style, and then people won't be attempted
Flag
to
football.
flag football. It's a tremendous. They're trying to get flag football in the 2028 Olympic Games.
Yeah.
And it's really popular around the world.
Well, that's
and
what
it-
the NFL Pro Bowl has become. It's a flag football game. It's
yeah, and then
interesting.
and women are playing too, girls and women. They're adding it in high schools. So maybe I don't know. We're seeing that the participation in contact football is really on the decline, even though viewership has never been higher. So
As we look at these stories too, I mean, it really does put into perspective just how young of a sport football is,
mm-hmm,
how young of a country we have,
mm-hmm,
that this was really not that long ago, right?
yeah.
In when you think of the grand scheme of things, I think of today's football. As you talked about some of the rule changes, like targeting.
Mm-hmm.
Targeting is one of the most talked about probably penalties in the sport. Is their intention to cause harm, right?
Right.
That's something that gets thrown around a lot in college sports these days. So I think as you mentioned, intent obviously has changed from when these men, the three men you featured in the book, have played.
Mm-hmm.
But there is still that aspect of, this is a violent game, right? And that will probably never go away as long as there's tackling and 300-pound men throwing their bodies on one another, right?
Yes. They're big and they're fast, and that causes damage, right?
Yeah.
So, yeah.
But we have, I mean, as you've mentioned in the book, we have come a long way as a country, and but there are still those things that are out there, right?
Yeah.
Those racial undertones are still part of our everyday life. As much as we don't want them to be, they are. And I think NCAA and the NFL are obviously working towards improving that in their sport. So as Kirsten's question, like, what do you see as the future?
Mm-hmm.
I think there are very positive steps that are being made. And as far as recognizing players like Iowa State has done, I think, like as you mentioned, it's a commendable thing that they've done, naming the stadium after him. The uniforms they wore this year were very cool, and a nice throwback to Jack Trice and the players that played with him. So
yeah, that was cool. That was pretty cool. Yeah.
We did have a question that came in through the chat, and I did want to make sure we get to some of those. Is it okay if we get to some of those, Jamie? Can we start?
Yeah, that's great.
Start peppering you with some of these. So Daniel asks, as two of the main characters were injured in a game with Minnesota specifically, did you get any records or comments from the University of Minnesota about those two?
Daniel, that is a great question. I absolutely should have. I didn't. I didn't get any official comments from anyone. I was sort of looking at the archival records and the media coverage, but yeah, that would just add such a wonderful layer to this. Yeah, and Minnesota really hadn't preserved much in their archives for either event. So the first one was the Trice one initially, and then the second one was the Aie Simmons in 1935 was knocked unconscious like 3 times in one game, and it leads to this Floyd of Rosedale trophy. There was stuff on the creation of the trophy at Minnesota, mostly in the Minnesota Historical Archives. But yeah, I think finding that comment from a university would be tough, but really valuable.
Yeah. So as I'm curious, as you were able to get back to Iowa State recently, talk with some of the faculty, the staff, the students, what were some of the questions that you got from students here today on campus? What were some of the things that maybe they had asked you about with this story through your research that were interesting to you?
Yeah, so I was really lucky to be there last fall. And it wasn't so much questions. What really struck me was when it was over, people wanted to tell me that they had been students here in the 70s or the 90s when this went on. And it, that the controversy about the cat hall, or they knew this Milton McGriff, who was the president of the September 29th movement. And he was a great guy. He went on a hunger strike to draw attention to some of this, some of the things that were going on at Iowa State in the 1990s. So I just sort of the personal connections to this story that happened, the death was 100 years ago, but the ongoing stories still have this really significant personal resonance with people that really struck me when I was here.
Yeah.
Yeah.
We got another question from Maddie, who wants to know if you can just elaborate or explain maybe the stories of, we do have an Iowa State audience here that may not have understood fully the stories of these other two, Aie Simmons and John Bright. Can you explain just a little bit more about their stories and the significance of their stories as well?
Well, Maddie, I don't want to make you sorry you asked this question because I could talk about this way too much. So I'll try to be succinct here. So Aie Simmons, the Trice story. The following decade, Aie Simmons was playing for Iowa. It's hard for us to imagine, but at that time there was only about 12 Black players playing college football at predominantly white institutions. There were more playing at segregated institutions. But he was a tremendous player. He should have been an All-American. He should have been captain of his team, and he was passed over for those things. And it was really for racial reasons. There's stories about how his team didn't block for him. He was a running back, and he was, it's a tremendous story. But the Floyd of Rosedale thing, after the 35 game when he was knocked out 3 times, had to leave the game, there was really no sort of outcry after it. But before the 36 game, the coach made a comment about it, or the governor of Iowa made a comment, if the refs stand for any rough tactics like they did last year, I'm sure the Iowa fans won't. And so the coach of Minnesota took that as a threat, right? That if anything happened to Simmons on the field, the Iowa stands were going to come down and flood the field and go after their players. And so it became this really big issue. There were talks of canceling the game. Minnesota came down to play Iowa. They wouldn't stay in the state. They stayed across the border in Illinois, and they had a police escort coming in. And so to sort of diffuse racial tensions, the governor of Minnesota bets the governor of Iowa a prize hog. The loser has to pay the other governor the prize hog, whoever wins the game, right? And so it was sort of this good-natured bet between 2 politicians, and it made people forget about Aie Simmons and the injuries that he had sustained the year before. And so in a story, the book is really about cultural memory. And so this was sort of, forgetting is a part of remembering. And this was my argument was that it was a way to forget Aie Simmons and the injustices that he endured when he was at Iowa. The Johnny Bright story took place in 1951. And Johnny Bright, as a sophomore, before 1972, freshmen weren't eligible to play varsity football. So he played on the freshman squad in 48. In 49, as a sophomore, he leads the nation in total offense, right? As a sophomore, he does the same thing as a junior. Senior year, he's poised to do that again. There's talk of him being a Heisman Trophy candidate. He would have been the first Black Heisman Trophy winner. That doesn't happen for another 10 years with Ernie Davis from Syracuse. But they have a game against Oklahoma State. And at that time, Oklahoma State was Oklahoma A&M, and it was a segregated institution. And so Drake University goes down, and they have several Black players on their team. They go down to Stillwater, Oklahoma to play. The Des Moines Register sent a camera crew, and they could only stay for just a little while. I'll set this up, and then if you can play that would be great.
Sure.
Well, I'll just let you play it. I should stop talking so much.
Okay, just give me 1 second. I had it here. Let me pull it up here.
Okay.
So we had 2 different clips that you sent us, and this is from the Des Moines Register.
This is game footage that they.
This is game footage. Okay.
Yeah. So that's Bright hands off the ball. He's nowhere near the ball. Oh no, it froze. And you can see, that's Wilbanks Smith from Oklahoma A&M, just clocks him, right? And the point is, he's nowhere near the ball. So to make the argument that it's just part of normal rough play in the course of a football game is hogwash, right? He was targeting Bright, right? And then it becomes the question that Kirsten raised earlier: was he hurt because he was their best player, or was he hurt because he was Black, right? Those are the photos that won the Pulitzer Prize for the Des Moines Register, because we have, for the first time, kind of irrefutable evidence that a white player targeted a Black player on the field of play. This in the first sort of 7 minutes, the first play of the game, Bright is knocked unconscious. That shot that you saw, it shattered his jaw, and somehow he got up and kept playing. And in the next play, he throws a 61-yard touchdown, right? It's just really something. but so these photographs are really important. But there were no fouls called against Oklahoma A&M or Wilbank Smith in the course of the game, and the argument was that the refs were watching the ball; they weren't paying attention to Bright. But Drake was incensed after this happened, and they said, we need an apology. We need some sort of punishment meted out to Smith and the coach and the school, and nothing happened. And so Drake actually withdrew from the conference in protest, and Bradley followed them as well. It was a really big deal. And the Bright story goes on and on. In 1952, the following year, he's drafted in the first round of the NFL draft by the Philadelphia Eagles. He was the fifth pick in the first round. And he decides that, he would have been the first Black player on the Eagles team. The Eagles had a lot of players from the South. And he said, I don't want to put myself through that again. So he took the opportunity and went up to Canada and played in the Canadian Football League and eventually became a Canadian citizen. But yeah, so I get really excited when I get to tell these stories, but they're awful stories, really. So,
yeah. Julie had an interesting comment and related to this. Maybe if you thought about the impact that photography had with sports coverage and documenting some of this at the time, I guess, where it was very hard to come across, documentation of images. Like there are very few images of Jack Trice, right?
Right.
That was so early on. This would have been later, right, after Jack.
Yeah.
So maybe a bit more photography and video coverage of those events. And obviously there's cameras everywhere today now, so nothing gets missed. But back then, that was a big deal to have something like that documented.
It was such a big deal. And it's a real testament, I think, to the Des Moines Register that had one of the best sport pages in the nation at the time. And they had the foresight to send these photographers down. So they had one guy that did could take a lot of images at once, and one that could kind of hone in on what was going on the field. But they could only stay for like the first half because they had to fly back to Des Moines and get their photographs developed and put out for publication. So it was just really it's fortunate, I guess, that they had the foresight to send these photographers down there. But yeah, I think it changed the perception of sport photography, right? Like, before it wasn't really documenting sort of serious or historically significant events. It's certainly changed since then, but this is one of the first, I think, cases where sport photography really has a social impact. And so, yeah, I don't know exactly how it sort of transformed the field, but I imagine, people started to take it seriously, and it sort of incentivized people to think about, the importance of having photographers at some monumental occasions. So
yeah. And Drake University named their football field Johnny Bright Field. I believe it was in 2006, as I was reading. So commend Drake for doing that, and a very appropriate thing for them to do to honor him in that way.
And I think they've named a college after him. They have a 2-year program, and Bright went on to be an educator in Canada, and I think that sort of recognizes the legacy of how important education was to him. So yeah, another wonderful thing that Drake has done.
Yeah, absolutely. Really is interesting too, as you've mentioned, just the fact that these 3 stories were from Iowa institutions right here in Iowa. So interesting to, as you put in this book, those 3 stories, really how they resonate together and kind of intermingle, obviously coming from different decades and different time periods, but all carry very similar weight. It's been a while since you put the book out. What kind of sticks with you through this book? What will you always remember about this book throughout your career? I know you have another book coming out. We'll talk about it in a minute, but what's kind of your lasting memory as you put this book together?
Just the sort of power of stories. I think sometimes when we put academic books together, it's more sort of like critical analysis, and you don't really get the narrative and the impact of individual stories. And this was my favorite book to write. I loved writing it, even though it was really sort of difficult subject material sometimes, because it gets to sort of tell the story of these people that we really should know more about. So So I hope I've done him justice. I know it's not my story to tell, but just the power of stories, I think.
Yeah, really interesting. And there's the picture right on your cover there
Yeah.
of the that's the Des Moines Register's images, I believe, right? Those
Yeah.
three,
Yeah.
the series of three. And what year was that they won that?
That was 19. So I think the photos from 1951, and the prize might have been 1952.
Okay.
John Robinson and Don Oltang were the name of the photographers.
Really interesting.
Yeah, and that I think one of them said at one point, without those photos, there wouldn't have been a Johnny Bright incident, right? It's called the Johnny Bright incident, even though maybe it should be called the Wilbank Smith incident because he's the one that's getting him there. But it's sort of, without those photos, what would we do with the story? Yeah.
And Matt, I think we have one more question in the chat.
Yeah, I believe so. I think that's actually, this may be from Jeff, and he actually just messaged that he might want to join us here in the chat. So he may be hopping on here with through video here in a minute, but so maybe we'll pause on that one question until the end. And I wanted to ask you about your book, Jaime, that you have coming out, Regulating Bodies. What can you tell us about your upcoming book?
Oh, well, I get to tell stories, but it's not the same as Moments of Impact. So I don't want to bore people with my stuff, but yeah, it looks at policies in elite sport that classify bodies according to weight or age or sex or impairment, disability, sport, or doping and natural, and sort of the unintended consequences of those policies. So weight classes are great; they help equalize competition, but they also sort of can encourage unhealthy weight management tactics, right? So that would be just one example. Yeah.
Well, it looks like we do have our Alumni Association President and CEO, Jeff Johnson. I believe he's joining through audio. Jeff, can you hear us?
I can hear you.
Hey, Jeff. Thanks so much for joining us. I know you had a question for Jaime.
Yeah, Jaime, and I put this in the chat as well, but you know that word choice is so important in communicating messages. I wanted to know if you found in your research any consideration for institutions to use memorialization language in their commemorative efforts, and if so, what impact would this have made?
Oh God, you're right. Language is so important, and I don't envy people the task that have to sort of put this together in ways that are inclusive and engaging and instructive. Yeah, I don't know how to answer that so much. Even though can you maybe do you have any insight on that question, Jeff? Or
Well, let me just give you and these are just my thoughts.
Mhm.
You have really made a strong case, and one in which I reflect on a lot. Sometimes it takes tragedy to get a memorial.
Mhm.
And this started out as the Jack Trice Memorial Committee.
Right.
But then when the stadium was physically named, it was just named Jack Trice Stadium,
Mhm.
which one could infer who is Jack Trice if they don't know. Whereas if you walk into Washington, D.C. and you go to the Washington Memorial or the Lincoln Memorial or even into our Memorial Union or in the stadium in Illinois, Memorial Stadium, Memorial tells you that there's a story behind the name.
Mhm.
And so one could wonder, was this story to live on? I don't question that.
Mhm.
And one of the things that Matt said tonight, we had the 100th anniversary or celebration, and I remind people that it was a commemoration, not a celebration, because we don't celebrate death.
Mhm.
We can celebrate life and the lives of someone. But it's interesting, I think, that this is not a memorial.
Yeah. Yeah, that's really interesting. If you tack on the word memorial, it asks you to engage with history, doesn't it? Engage with the story. Whereas if it's just the name, as you said, then it's a name, right? It's a name like any other. But that you're right. That word memorial asks for a different type of engagement. Yeah, I did not see any discussions about that, and I wonder if they went on and they just were somehow behind the scenes. But it's a really, really interesting point. And you're right. We commemorate the death do we celebrate his life or do we commemorate his death? And I think a lot of times it's more the commemoration aspect, right? Because his life was so short.
It was so short, but I think it's also a place of safety.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah. How do you mean? I agree with you, but I'm curious to know how you mean.
It leaves the story to be no story unless someone asks a question.
Yeah. I think you're made a really smart point there, Jeff. Thank you.
Thanks, Jeff. Thanks for the question and joining us. We appreciate it.
No, it's good to be here.
Thank you. Well, Jaime, thank you so much for joining us. We really appreciate you taking your evening, your time. Any parting words as we wrap up tonight?
Just to reiterate how grateful I am for this opportunity and to have the chance to talk about this history. I just so appreciate it. Thank you. And I hope everybody's safe in the snow.
Yes, thank you so much.
Right.
We hope I don't know if you get any snow out in Pennsylvania, but we wish the same to you and have a great rest of the semester. I guess you guys are probably getting started here pretty soon, aren't you?
Yeah, we're in week 2 already, if you can believe it.
Sounds great. Well, Jaime, thank you so much again. We'll talk to you soon, okay?
Thank you, Matt. Thank you, Kirsten. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, Jaime.
Well, thank you. Well, thank you so much for everyone who watched here tonight and commented in the chat. We want to thank you so much. We will be announcing our 5th book in this book club series in the spring of the Iowa Stater, which will be sent to Alumni Association members here coming up in the next couple of months, and then emailed out to all alumni and friends shortly after. So stay tuned for that news.
Yes, but before we sign off, we're going to select one person who commented in the chat tonight to receive an ISU prize pack.
Yes, let me get the contest pulled up. So it looks like we had 10 people comment here tonight. So we're going to run that drawing here. And thank you again to everyone who participated and read the book and engaged with us in this event. Really appreciate it. I think that's Jeff. So
I think we need a rego on that one.
Okay, we'll draw one more winner. Hang on a sec. Okay. Stop sharing my screen.
And then there was a question while you're loading that up
Yep.
about whether it'll be available online. And yes, this recording will be available online,
Yes.
I believe on the
same link.
YouTube. Yep, same link.
I hope it doesn't pick. Oh my gosh. I knew this was going to happen. Kate Tyndall, she's also an employee. We're going to run one more time. Jeez. Someone's going to win this. And it better not pick the ISU Alumni Association. If it does, there we go. Julie. Congratulations,
Congrats, Julie.
Yes, you'll be receiving an email from the Alumni Association on receiving your ISU prize pack. Thanks so much. All right. Well, that's it. That's our book club conversation. Again, we want to thank Jaime Schultz so much for joining us. Again, we want to also send a big thank you to our Alumni Association members for making this possible. We could not do it without you. Again, isualum.org/join is the link if you want to join us as an Alumni Association member. Now is a great time to do it. Again, it makes events like these possible and all of our Student and Alumni Association programming. Well, for Kirsten Crackleo, I'm Matt Van Winkle. Thank you so much for watching our Iowa Stater Book Club conversation. We'll see you again next time.